So here it is, episode 3 of the podcast, and unfortunately I still don't have a working title, so if you have anything that you could suggest, that would be great. I would take that in advisement, because it can't be called podcast forever, I suppose. That would be kind of weird. But I also don't want to not make episodes until I have a title, so we'll just figure it out eventually. This one will be called The Past and Present and Future with Jason Moses O'Toole. He is an ideal individual within the CSGO community to speak on these topics with, and it was definitely somewhat appealing to get a little bit nostalgic and talk about some of the older days with Jason. He's been around forever. He was playing at the professional level in the 1.6 days in North America, and he's seen it all really as far as esports and the pre-esports era is concerned, if that's a thing that you sort of believe in. Esports before it's called esports. And he's currently, if you don't know, and I imagine if you follow CSGO, you will know of him. He is Talent. He started off as an analyst, doing a lot of great work translating the more complex things happening in CSGO to the newer audiences and the older audiences alike. And he does it very well, and he since has moved to also doing work every so often in hosting, but more commonly as a commentator, a move that he wanted to make for a while and has done in so with Anders. Now that Semler has departed that duo, we have Anders and Moses. So definitely going to be a lot of fun talking to Jason. So without further ado, it's time to get into today's episode. All right, thank you for joining me, Jason. You're going to be number 3 on. I don't have a name for this yet. I don't know if you have any suggestions, but still work in progress on the name front.
Listen, I know Duncan and I used to name our shows based around something that occurred in them. So maybe you just pick one of your favorite moments of where we say something stupid, which will definitely happen, and we can pick from there.
Nice, yeah, I like that. That's a pretty good naming methodology. I can dig it.
It's very easy when you have someone like Duncan on the show, because he says the most outrageous things. So you're always going to get like some form of like not clickbait, but definitely an attention grabbing title to your show.
That's a good point. There's no question when it comes to that for Duncan. So let's jump into it then. So I've named this Past, Present, and Future with Jason Moses O'Toole, which is
X-Men 7.
Yeah, right.
And it's me, Professor X.
Indeed. Oh God, I didn't even make the connection. Oh dear, that's pretty good. I like it.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons why I wanted to do this with you. I mean, there's a vast array of topics that we could talk about, and I'm sure I'm going to have you back on many times. But one of the reasons I wanted to go through on this particular topic right now is because recently, of course, I saw a tweet from Stewie, and he's like, "Oh no, just like that, CS might have died," is what he said, and in reference to the Fortnite $100 million that's being sort of distributed over the year for their tournaments. Yep. And your response was. And I often see you making these responses. You very much have the sort of I've been around the block a few times type sort of vibe in the CS community, and you said CS has survived far worse. Don't be afraid, little one. So I like that, and so I wanted to, because there's a lot of people that are sort of post. Like again, like no one really defines the errors in any way just yet, but I kind of like to define them, myself by saying like 2010, sort of when Twitch first came about. That's sort of like that's the esports era. Anything before that's like kind of the pre-esports era. So I don't know like if that really holds any water, but anyways. So for the people that weren't around before Twitch, can you tell us about some of the what springs to mind when you think of the biggest challenges and actual catastrophes from the past, things that threaten the existence of CS as we knew it as a game we love to play?
I mean, I would say like right off the bat, once you say like, what do you think of when you think of like an esports catastrophe as it pertains to Counter-Strike? I would my first thought just goes right to CGS.
I knew it.
Yeah, I think everyone who was around back then kind of is the same way with that kind of a catastrophe. But I mean that's an era of Counter-Strike where CGS essentially comes in. I did a video on this as well a few years back, but CGS came in and It was this big production. It was this big thing. It was kind of what like OWL and even I guess LCS to a certain degree, where it was franchise model. All the teams like got moved, so complexity became what? There was the Los Angeles complexity. There was the Chicago Chimera. There was the New York something. I forget what exactly they were. But there was a team in the Carolinas and all this shit. And it was way before the infrastructure was actually able to handle kind of regional fan bases, like there would be money in the regional areas. But anyways, when that inevitably failed, which I think even the people involved kind of saw that coming very very quickly, if you speak to them about it. They had taken all the teams and they basically said you can no longer play 1.6 games even during the off season. You guys are just your CGS players. You're only allowed to play in tournaments that have CS source. And it essentially took, at least in North America, took the entire 1.6 scene. I know over in Europe, the split was a little bit more divided because there were a few more source teams. In North America, there was only like one source team at the time, maybe two. I think Team Dynamic was kind of the big one. I'm not entirely sure when they formed. I wasn't too knowledgeable of the source scene, but anyways, when it died, all these teams no longer had anything to do. All these former 1.6 teams and players, the guys who'd been playing for 7, 8 years, had been, top placers at CPLs, had been world champions at some point. There was no 1.6 scene to return to because for 2 years or a year and a half, that had been decimated by this switch. There were no more grassroots tournaments. There was no more, big tournaments whatsoever. There was no more money in it because there was no one really interested at that point because the entire 1.6 scene had been dead and killed off by CGS to begin with. So the fact that we survived that, and I guess this is a good place. Sorry to do this on your show, is where with all the negative publicity that ESEA gets, ESEA was really heroic at that point in time because ESEA was really the only Counter-Strike company and venture that was making a lot of money in the Americas. And they just basically came up, and that's when ESEA League started. They saw the vacuum. They saw the need for some kind of a league, some kind of a tournament, and they became the new one. And they just basically said, listen, we're making all this money from our subscribers. We can build a league. We're going to start out small and we'll grow this up over years. And that's kind of where we saw it get to. Those ESEA lands that we saw at the beginning of CSGO had been going on for a while, and just then they kind of got to the levels of high prize pools.
Beyond the ESEA, do you think there's anything else really that's sort of contributed to saving everything? Because obviously there was a lot of other things that were going on that were problematic as well.
I mean, even just in general, even without that major CGS failure, I know, for instance, I mean, just you want to talk about not a catastrophe, but another thing that was quite dangerous to the scene at the time that we survived through was just in general the release of Source. That really split the community and divided it in two. That was something where you saw all these players who had been competing in 1.6 and like main level teams and open level teams. They've been trying for years to become professional. It's a very difficult thing to break into the professional scene. And once you're there, it's very difficult to fall out of it. And I think I know a lot of people have issue with that these days, and that's been lessening. But it very much was like a professional teams group where once you were there, you were to get recycled onto another team if you ever got cut. So it wasn't easy for new people to break into it. And a lot of the people that tried, switched to Source when it came out. And so you had this divided community where half the attention was on 1.6, half the attention was on Source. Now, the good thing was back then, we didn't have the streaming platforms like Twitch, right? So your sponsorships for these esports events were very much just kind of given to high publicity games, not necessarily based on viewership. Yeah, you weren't selling viewership to these companies the way we are with Twitch now. So we kind of could still get sponsored for 1.6 or sponsored for Source once those came out. Um, but I mean, that in itself is a very difficult thing to survive, is half your player base just going away. And by the way, when the CGS catastrophe happened, just to circle back, not to jump around, but once that ESEA League came out, all the top players and teams back then basically retired. They kind of left, and they're like, oh, we were making, maybe $3,000 or $2,500 a month was a high salary back then. We were making this, and now there's just no market. There's no reason for these orgs to pay us. There's other games out there now. Call of Duty was getting big. StarCraft was still around. So the players also that had been in main all of a sudden got promoted to being the best teams in North America, right? Like if you're a shit tier player and everyone above shit tier leaves the game, all of a sudden you're the god, just by virtue of no one being above you. And I think that was one thing that held the States back, even stretching into the early years of CSGO. But there's been things like that. I mean, you think of the other cast, you think of Virtus Pro. That's a team that's been high-profile players. They've won majors in 1.6. All the sponsorship catastrophes they've went to. We've seen Counter-Strike has survived CPL, which was like the bedrock, the foundation of Counter-Strike as an esports. All the scandals that came out when that shut down, all the missed payments, all the prize money, the prize pools that weren't paid out to teams. Um, we've survived some real shady shit in Counter Strike, and I think that Stewie thing was just a bit much. It's not just Stewie as well; it's other players out there. Not to just focus on him, but this scene, and this kind of touches on your most recent question, has always survived, and not only that, but thrived based off of the love and the passion and the creativity of the community. Like it's never been because Valve was this supporting hand that was propping us up the way that other developers kind of have to do with their games and their games esports infrastructure. This has largely always been built from a community and a grassroots level, and that's what's allowed us to survive for 20 years now. I think very few, or 19 years, I guess it would be at this point. Very few games can boast that. And I think it's very dangerous to have the conversation that's happening publicly, whether it be professional players outright bashing the devs, or outright saying Counter-Strike is dead, or outright saying Counter-Strike is going to die. I think that's a very dangerous conversation for professional players, especially, to be kicking off, because it permeates to the lower levels. It trickles down to the lower levels of the community, and that's when you start seeing all the posts on Reddit, this game is dying, or just the joking YouTube posts. But if you get enough of those, if enough people who don't actually know the scene intimately enough see all these posts, they're going to start believing Counter-Strike is dying, and that in turn is going to propagate that kind of idea, and it's going to in some ways bring that into reality. So I've gotten to the point now where, to be on a soapbox a little bit, I guess, where I'm going to I feel like it's my responsibility in a way to be more outspoken in telling people to shut the fuck up when that happens, like whether it's a player or not. But I feel like there's only a certain point. I'm just so tired of seeing players publicly bashing the game and talking so disappointingly about it when they've all been through the growing pains in the past. This is the best we've ever had it. And to see a player that's making $20,000 a month say the game is dying, I think is really unfair of them, really unjust, and it's quite dangerous to me, in my mind.
It's quite amusing, especially like in the in the context of all of the past and being around in the early days. And do you think because you sort of briefly mentioned like some like new game iterations, creating like a community splitting effect. Do you think that was a really big deal? Because when we looked at it, way back when, it seemed like the biggest thing ever. You got World of Warcraft coming along, and everyone's playing that because there's not a new update for 1.6 or something like that, and the game is a little bit boring to people. And again, there's like no way to really make a lot of money from it unless you're a very top level player already. And I remember actually on all the forums and stuff that Quake players hated UT players, and UT players hated Quake players, but both Quake and UT players hated CS players. But then when World of Warcraft came out, Quake, UT, and CS players sort of banded together as brothers to collectively hate on World of Warcraft and the damage it had done to our collective FPS scenes.
I mean, I don't. A game like Warcraft never had like an impact on like destroying the community, right, of the player base of Counter-Strike, but it certainly took time away. I've always made this joke, and there's a lot of truth to it. Is the three things that you need to stay away from if you're a professional player, or you need to the three things that have the highest risk of destroying your career as a professional player. And I think even a League of Legends caster got in trouble for saying something along these lines. So I guess in a way I have to be careful, but I also don't really give a shit. One of it is marijuana, or cannabis, whatever you people out there prefer. The other one are girlfriends, and the third one is World of Warcraft. I've seen more players, and I guess with World of Warcraft nowadays, with that kind of being phased out to a certain degree, you can kind of just say other games, like insert PUBG, insert Fortnite, insert legal, whatever you want to do, whatever your other game is. Those just occupy so much time, and in the early days it was World of Warcraft, and I can't tell you the amount of players that I saw their individual level back in 1.6 slip once World of Warcraft came out, or the amount of teams that all of a sudden looked so uncoordinated inside of the game once World of Warcraft came out, all because instead of watching a demo before practice, or instead of deathmatching or whatever it was before practice, you'd be playing World of Warcraft up until 2 minutes before, and then you'd get up and you go take a piss, and you'd come back and you sit down for practice. So all of a sudden, you're not having as much time. I mean, playing at this level of competition is very time consuming. And I guess I was lucky all through my early career that I was never occupied by a game the way that Counter-Strike did. That was, I mean, even today, Counter-Strike is one of the few games that I even play. All my other games are just like mindless, stupid shit. So, Clash Royale. Well, I mean, that's because while traveling, it's one of the rare games that I always have access to, right? Now with Nintendo Switch out, I can mess with that a little bit. But I mean, even at the end of the day, and I don't even get to do this often because of how often we travel. I play League of Legends, but I only play the ARAMs. I don't even play the actual competitive mode. I just want to go into a one lane, just blow each other up. There's 10 people in a very confined space, and you play a quick 15 to 20-minute game, and you're done. And maybe I knock out like 2 or 3 of those and then go to bed. Just, something to relax with. Right now, I'm on a whole Diablo 3 kick, and I know all the Diablo 2 loyalists are going to yell at me and everything like that, but it's just a game where I can turn off my brain and just, blow something up and just relax and listen to music or watch a show on Netflix while I'm doing it. But no, I think it's silly to kind of think that some of these other games, I mean, especially if it's not an FPS, it's not really going to split things. But I think one thing you have to remember is, even to this day, Counter-Strike players and fans are very elitist, and we're very proud of the legacy that Counter-Strike has had. And I think what's kind of happened in this generation of players and in this generation of the community is that it's almost developed into an insecurity where we're so proud that we're lashing out at all the other games. Like, I make some jokes about Call of Duty, but I don't think Call of Duty is ever going to steal the fan base. Call of Duty is always going to be, to me, it's going to be like a game where, you play it, during college, and you kind of get hooked on it during college, or at least that's what it was for me. And you get hooked to the single player, but it's kind of like a different pool of gamers that are attracted to competing than are attracted to Counter-Strike.
It's an interesting point, actually. I mean, just to circle back on it just ever so slightly, as this is often a discussion when you talk about, people get criticized. I remember there's been various Reddit posts of people who sort of, I won't say spy, because if you have a public profile, whatever, on Steam, you can see how many hours someone has on this game, on that game, and people look at some of the professional players, and I think like one that springs to mind is like, some of the VP players, obviously they're easy to ridicule because they're having such hard times and so on. And how do you interpret that? Really, is it just like a discipline thing, like a work ethic thing? Like, are these players, because as you're rightly saying, effectively it takes time away from you playing the game that is your profession, but at the same time, do you think this could even just, do you think there's a more complicated story there? Do you think that in some teams it's just like a lack of practice structure, or is there something else behind that, or do you think that players, generally speaking, are just too easily distracted, and that's like part of the nature of what we're doing? Because, for example, in contrast, if you're a football player and you go onto a football pitch and you're at a football training, like that's a very specifically, very, very, blocked out amount of training. You can't, sneak away and play PUBG or something there. So do you think the story is more complex, or like, what is your take on this? Because usually I think people look at it from a very surface perspective.
I'd say I'm hesitant to kind of judge players by by how many hours they have logged in. For one, like, you never know if they're at like a tournament or a LAN center or a boot camp, and for whatever reason they're not using their Steam ID, and that's a very easy one. But I doubt that happens too much these days. But also, I think you have to look at the context around it as well. For instance, we know that a lot of teams at the moment are in disarray and are going through roster changes. So just in general, like for instance, the French players, we know they've been going through this whole thing where 2 teams are forming, and they're waiting to see if the first team fails to steal some of those players into the second team. And if you're playing under those conditions, and you're playing with people who, if you are, NBK's taking the reins, and all of a sudden he's trying to shift the focus of how G2 wants to play. And if you're someone who doesn't agree with that vision, you're not focusing as much on trying to learn it, and you're not trying as hard in practice, which one makes you and the team play better, but also makes everyone not having fun to play the game. The fun of being on a team in Counter-Strike is that you have 5 guys who are really working together, and the fun doesn't come from the work. It comes from seeing the results in that work. And if you're not finding ways to have fun in that, and you're not even working to get the improvement and to see those results, then you're never going to have fun. So then all of a sudden you don't want to play Counter-Strike. Then all of a sudden, every time you think, oh, I should go deathmatch for 2 hours, and then when your brain associates Counter-Strike with just the miserable practices that you've had for the past 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, all of a sudden you just don't want to touch it as much as outside of the mandated hours. So I think there's a factor there with a lot of teams. I think in general, I don't want to say overall that players aren't dedicated or aren't working hard, but I do think there is, to a degree, a work ethic problem that probably varies from team to team, that from player to player. And I think if you look at the root cause, or I mean, if you look at not the root cause, but if you look at the ends of the spectrum, if you look at a team like Astralis, obviously the hardest working team we have in the scene, and the way they're able to innovate and the way they're able to dominate. I just saw on Reddit, I think it is, at the moment, like there's a post that says like they've won something like 90% of their games this month, which is just mental. So you can obviously see the disparity. It's not that Astralis is the hardest working, but it's the fact that the next closest team that could compete with them probably is what, FaZe, you would say, and they're going through a roster change from Exist back to Olaf, so they probably haven't gotten into the swing of things with practice. So again, there's a reason for that work ethic dropping there. But overall, this scene does, from what the conversations that we have with players at events, have an issue with people dedicating enough time, not only on an individual basis, but on a team basis. And there's also, to be frank, not to continue to extend this, but there is a misunderstanding. I think more than anything, it may not necessarily even be the amount of time you're putting into it, but it's the efficiency of the time that you are putting into it. You can't expect to practice and be a professional team and just hop in a server every night after an hour of deathmatch and just play. It takes a lot of conversations outside the server with 5 people in. It takes a lot of theory crafting of talking about how you want to handle a certain situation. And I think that's where teams lack the most. And I think, some of these other things that have popped up with Fortnite and everything and the 100 million, I think that just kind of exacerbates the situation. Maybe Valve not being as vocal or updating as much as possible. But again, those are obstacles that are easy to overcome. If you're a player right now, you can't be saying, oh, why would we want to practice? Valve hasn't updated the game. Fuck yourself. Like there's nothing that Valve's like. You can't blame Valve for the fact that you're not interested in playing the game. This is your job. What motivates you is the $20,000 that goes into your bank account every month. That should be enough. And if it's not, then you look at the prestige and the ability to travel around the world and be an icon and be someone that people look up to, and essentially be an athlete in a way. Not maybe. I mean, let's not get into that whole debate. But be someone that fans are going to look up to and want to take a picture with you and want to sign an autograph. That's a very cool feeling, even for me at events. And I'm not nearly as popular for some of these players. So I mean, there's a whole lot of issues that go into it. I think that it's always, you can't just boil it down to one thing, like, oh, he doesn't have hours. It's why doesn't he have the hours? And then you think about the schedule that these guys have. Of course, they're all going to be burnt out. Of course, we're going to see hours drop because we play in 2 online leagues, and there's an event every week if teams want to go to it, if they want to be that busy. And if you're a player, it's just like, I know for me, when I have free time, I'm just like, get me the fuck away from Counter-Strike. And I love this game. I bleed for this game, and I sacrifice a lot of things to be a commentator for this game, with all the travel that I do, and obviously it's well rewarded with the money and everything like that. But there's no break, in the schedule. There's no break for these players. So obviously you go to an event, then you play 3 days of online games, then you go to another event, then you have 2 days off. Of course you're not going to touch Counter-Strike.
Yeah, definitely agree. There's, as you say, like, I don't want to extend this too much, but I think it is a really cool talking point. I think, going straight back to the beginning point of your answer, I think something that a lot of teams also don't understand or think about enough is, and you do hear some players talking about this every so often, and it's about making the game fun. And I think to a lot of people, that's kind of an ambiguous statement, because it's kind of hard to quantify. What one person finds fun is what the next person might not find fun. But generally speaking, I think, as you say, there is like a very important association that you want to have when you're playing the game, and it can't be like just this association of misery and drudgery. And I do wonder, if, as you say, like, because you very clearly highlighted, like the first things that you talked about was traveling, playing the tournaments, and then playing the online leagues. You didn't even like that's already incredibly time consuming, and we weren't even talking about actual practice just yet. So
Yep.
it's
Yeah, no, it's mind-blowing.
it's really crazy. And also to as a brief comment on the next point as well, it is really, I think it's very interesting for all of us how we normalize to certain lifestyles as well, and how that can sort of impact you, and also sort of remove some of the in your minds, from a psychological perspective, you'll have sort of like, you're used to traveling all the time, you're used to casting all the time. I definitely have some moments where I wake up like doing an online league or something, and I wake up and I'm thinking to myself, Jesus, I actually get to go into work and commentate Counter-Strike for 8 hours.
Yeah.
And I'm actually excited about that. Now, I may not be excited about it about 4 or 5 hours in when I'm very tired, but like, I'm actually very excited by the fact that I as you stated too, like, I feel quite privileged to be able to spend my time in this way. And on my stream last night, I was actually, again, like, sort of talking about some of the past and the history, and talking about so many of the players that didn't make it into the esports era, let's say, and were not able to transfer their knowledge and their skill and their passion into what we now look at as our careers. So there are some people that didn't make it, but yeah, it's a lot of very interesting points there. But I would like to move it forwards a little bit, because I want to get into sort of talking about the present. But before we get there, I want to know, what is your favorite memory of like a scam? Because like, there were a lot, as like any new burgeoning industry, we had a lot of scam artists coming into esports as a whole. A lot of tournaments not paying out prize money, tournaments being very poorly organized, like power getting shut off halfway through events, monitors being stolen, and all this. There's crazy stuff. So do you have any favorite moments like that?
Yeah, I got two. Because I have to tell you these two. They're great. They're from way back when in the day. There was a team way back when, and it was. I'm gonna try and do this without saying names. I don't think it would matter, but I don't know if he's involved in anything at the moment. Anyways, there was a team that went to CPLs, placed high, placed top 5 in a bunch of different CPLs. And back then, CPL, when/if they paid out prize money to your team, they paid it to one point of contact. You couldn't have them split it up into 5 different payments. So every year there were always stories about a guy on a team who stole everyone's money and just quit and just disappeared, whatever. But this team happened to place top 5 in 3 different CPLs, and they had sponsors, and they had all this money coming in, and it was all going to this one point of contact. Back then, very few of these organizations were actually operational businesses the way we have them now. It was basically, this is our tag. It's not really an organization, it's a team, and all the money goes to our manager, who deals with all the flights, who deals with all the hotels and everything, and he distributes it all out for it. And obviously that's not a great system to have if you're a player, to just have to trust this guy. And obviously doesn't need to, or you don't even need to say it. There were no contracts really back then, or very few contracts. So anyways, this guy had been taking all this sponsorship money, and prize winnings, and this money's supposed to be given to the players, and he just took all of it, and it was something like 20 grand or something like that. And he just went off somewhere, just kind of logged out of IRC at the time, and just never came back, and all his points of contact with the players just got shut off or disconnected. And he just went, and the story was he went with one other player in the scene at the time and just did a bunch of fucking drugs, like off in the middle, and just blew it all on like drugs and hookers, and like no one even knows where it happened. I don't know if it was like some other country or whatever, but that was probably one of the funniest ones that I remember. But actually, this is definitely the funniest. This next one I have.
I just love the method, like the thought process there. I could give this money away, but what if I did
log out of everything and do a shit ton of blow? Yeah, it's always the existential question, isn't it? Yeah, so this next one requires a very quick backstory. This was and God bless this guy, and I don't think he'd be listening to this whatsoever, but I know he still monitors the scene from time to time, and I know someone probably knows him, will highlight this to him or something like that. But he was a guy who had he had gone to a CPL with a team, and he was like their sixth man. He hadn't really like made a big name for himself or a big reputation, and this was supposed to be one of the best teams from the country, from the USA. So he was kind of their sixth man coming into it, and obviously only play with 5 players, so he doesn't get to play too often. Well, what happens at CPLs back in the day is if you got placed in the loser bracket on the second or third day, you were just in a never-ending string of games until either the day ended and you'd play tomorrow, or you were eliminated. You would just set up at a station in the tournament area, and you would just never leave, except to like go to the bathroom, and then you have to go right back. So it'd be a marathon, like 16-hour day of just playing Counter-Strike matches of high intensity. And during one of the games, their team won a match, and they had like maybe like an hour off or something like that before the next game started. So one of their players was just like, "Dude, I'm exhausted. I've got to go sleep." And he went up to the room or went somewhere in the BYOC area, passed out in the corner of the ballroom, whatever it might have been. And he was like, "Will you wake me up when it's our time for the match?" And it's like, "Yeah." And he told that to the sixth man. So obviously, the sixth man does not indeed wake him up for the match, and decides to play in it himself, and proceeds to go this -1 and 13 and a half.
Oh
Or
no.
no, not a half in the game. -1 and 13, which means he either killed himself or TK'd a teammate and die. Like, yeah, I mean, you obviously get it. And it was a blowout loss. Obviously, they get eliminated, and they were so mad about that. And that started, rumors about him cheating, rumors about him like cheating online, and rumors about him like not waking this guy up and everything. And anyway, when it came down to it, he like went up to his room or something, came back the next day, and his computer was in the BYOC, and someone had like came in and just taken everything out of it, taken the processor, taken the video card. His computer just got scalped right in the BYOC area, everything taken from it. So there's two ends of the scam there: the drama of not waking up the teammate, and then getting all your shit stolen as well to boot. So that wasn't a good weekend for him.
Wow, that's just the wild, wild west out there. That's it's pretty funny, man. It's crazy. There's like I guess no one's really like watching out for any of this stuff. That's kind of funny. And it does very quickly. Okay, so there's one last thing I actually do want to. I have to bring in about sort of the past. What is the thing that you miss the most about sort of the old days? I mean, you actually mentioned IRC, and I'm thinking to myself, the whole like IRC culture might have been one of them. But is there anything for you specifically? It may have been like LAN parties. It was very different back then.
Yeah, I definitely miss not LAN parties. Well, I do, but I definitely miss the IRC. That whole culture of the professional scene on IRC and everything was a really good time. The private channels, all all the professional players or invite players, whatever you want to call them. I think what I miss the most is there just wasn't as much scrutiny. There was in terms of what players said to each other. Like, there were some pretty epic shit talking moments between players back then that go far, far, far worse than what is said today, both in terms of just in general. I guess we can just leave it there so we don't go into too many details to get me in trouble. But
I mean, if it's in history, man, if it happens, then this is it. We're talking about history. You can feel free to bust open the archives.
And using words that are no longer allowed to be used in any sense, or probably weren't even allowed to be used back then. But you wouldn't get blasted the way that you did today for saying something that maybe encroaches on the line of personal. You could say whatever you wanted to people, and I've seen matches in IRC. There were some legendary players back then for getting into arguments, and I don't think he'll care these days. Fraud was one of them. Fraud was one of those players early on in his career who would just get into a shit talking match for hours and hours on end. And when my team recruited him, the first thing my brother said to him was like, "You got to stop this shit right now. Like, you don't get into these shit talking matches." And to his credit, he did for the most part, just a few blowups here and there. But I mean, it's just that kind of thing. If that ever got public today, players would just get destroyed for it, and deservedly so. When you encounter some of the language being used, we've already had one of those incidents recently with Sadicus. But when certain language is used, it strikes a nerve, and that goes too far. But in terms of the content of like what's said and being able to actually shit talk someone and actually go pretty hard, I wish we had that capability. I wish we had those kind of personalities. And I mean, I miss it but I know it's better for the scene overall that we don't have it anymore, because also these players nowadays are able to build their brands and encourage individual sponsorships the ways that we never could back then. So you have to be a little bit more clean cut. But I do miss that ability to just go all out on somebody and never have to worry about it. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why I always advocate, and I always get yelled at by the community for this because they think it's me being a killjoy. You know, when you see tournaments like especially the majors, especially the public player chat inside the server is public. So if you're watching through a GoTV, you can see what the players are saying to each other if they're typing it in the public chat. And I think that needs to be abolished entirely. I think that needs to just get that needs to be removed from the GoTV capabilities. I don't think there's any reason, there's any way that the public, that the viewers, the community should see what the professional players say to each other inside of a server, because they're always going to take something out of context. If there's a little bit of shit talk, maybe it goes too far, then all of a sudden this guy gets blasted, but you don't know the context of it. You don't know, maybe they have some, you know, maybe this guy's just trying to get into his head, knows he's mentally fragile. Maybe they have an inside joke that to the outside world seems a little bit too harsh or a little bit too edgy in some way. So I mean, I just kind of miss that ability to be edgy and to be aggressive with your smack talk, and you know, the scrutiny that comes along with it, I think is kind of bad.
I like that. It's like I was going for the wholesome IRC experience, and you know, you want the savagery, you miss the savagery, but I respect
Dude,
that.
I want someone to get up on
time.
stage and call someone a fucking punk. I want him to be like, this guy's a pussy, I'm gonna kick his ass across. Like, I would love to see a player do that in the server. Obviously you can't, or not in a server, on the stage in like a pregame interview. Like, these guys fucking suck. Like, they're not very good on this map, and who cares if you get, no, yeah, and I mean, fair play. You obviously can't then get blown out of a server, right? At least if it's close, you have some kind of an element. But I admire Config for that. And I mean, you know, I know a lot of players took issue with it, and I know a lot of the community took issue with it. But I want to have a character like that. I want to have someone who's willing to be the villain. It's just so hard on this day of social media where you're going to wake up to 200 notifications of people saying that you should be fired and that you're not professional enough. And I get it. I understand why players don't want to do it. But I admire in many ways people like Config. And while we're having the conversation, bring Duncan and Richard into this. They're people who don't mind being the villains. They don't seek it out always. Well, Duncan does sometimes, but I admire that to a certain degree, that you're willing to be the villain for the point of a show, for a little bit of entertainment. I mean, it's exactly what, you know, Henry just did for the show match in Sydney, Australia for IEM. And you know, it's important that we have people playing all the different roles to make sure this doesn't get stale and sanitized and boring.
Okay, so then I have to ask, was Flusha the greatest villain in CSGO history, or who is the greatest villain in, as far as the players are concerned so far?
Flusha is the greatest. He's the greatest villain, but it wasn't of his own making, right? He didn't want to be the villain. It wasn't until later that he kind of took that mantle upon himself, because he realized there was just no recovery. It's like me getting hit with the pie, right? I did not want to be Creamy Moses for a very long time. I still do not want to be Creamy Moses, but at a certain point you realize it's just not going to go away, so you might as well own up to it, just accept the fact and see what you can do with it. It's the same thing for Flusha. He obviously never wanted to be seen as a cheater. He never wanted to have that kind of, you know, that kind of shady connotation among the community. But at a certain point, it's not going to go away. It is awesome to see him wear the Senor Vac jersey and the hat that says like lifting on it or whatever it is. I think that's great, and I think it's awesome. And I love the fact that, remember, that Fnatic team as well, they talk some shit on the stage. I mean, they would just be up there and be like, listen, we're Fnatic, we just win. And like, a lot of teams and a lot of fans didn't like that, saw it as arrogance, but it was earned arrogance. It wasn't like it came out of nowhere. You know, they'd won everything.
Love it. Absolutely love it. So, oh man, what a character Flusha is. So moving forwards then, we spoke about the past for quite some time. So let's talk about some of the present issues that we're experiencing. We talked about how, you know, Stewie perhaps, not necessarily using Stewie's name, you know, perhaps he was just sort of jumping on the sort of bandwagon a little bit.
He's going to be the example. He'll be the head on the spike.
Okay. All right. Stewie's head on the spike. So obviously he was talking about an issue that's not really an issue, and if anything, really it just could potentially serve to help actually CS:GO in the long run, by bringing more money, more FPS players, and so on into the fray. But as far as actual issues are concerned, like when we're talking about actual issues, I think these days infrastructure is not necessarily something we're as concerned about. I think people are generally concerned about the potential for a bubble, with regards to all the investment money that's going into the Overwatch League, and how that may be something that explodes and has a sort of a backlash on esports as an ecosystem as a whole, by sort of disincentivizing investor money in the future. But if we ignore that a little bit, because that's a whole discussion of its own, with the actual game and the integrity of the competition and things that may be harming that, obviously the thing that has mostly been in the discussion in this vein has been the CZ75 of late. If there's anything else like that, let me know. But you also recently tweeted something that I think you're probably coming from the same perspective that I was, about how, like, because everyone's talking about how to change the CZ75, and my suggestion and your suggestion was to just have it share a slot with the Deagle, because that actually creates that fixes one of the issues, in that it is obviously, like, from a game design perspective, you don't want to ever have a decision that is like, you don't want to have like 5 options and then one option always be the best decision in every single instance that you can possibly conceive. That's just terrible game design, and that's what the CZ is right now, honestly speaking. But if it was to share a slot with the Deagle, there's actually 2 very different functions there. Maybe it costs a bit more money. People have to make a choice. Is this the most pressing thing that we have to worry about? Is this perhaps maybe the most feasible response we could see from Valve? Because obviously they're thinking about skins. They don't want to remove the gun at all. If a gun gets in, I think we can assume it's not going out.
I think it would be. I think the best way to put it is it's the most pressing issue we have in Counter-Strike that Valve has control of. Does that make sense? Like, I'd rather, for instance, see the schedule problem fixed over the CZ. I'd rather keep the CZ the way it is right now. I'd keep everything intact and fix all these scheduling issues that we have across the entire year of Counter-Strike than fix the CZ. But we don't have a say in that. So and equally, Valve kind of, I guess, has a say in the scheduling thing, but with the hands-off approach, they're not going to have anything to do with it. So yeah, I think the CZ is probably up there with the biggest one. I think maps is another one that's probably close by, finding some way to either introduce more maps more frequently, have a pretty refreshed kind of rotation, or change the maps we currently have in a way that keeps the competitive integrity. But the CZ is a big one, and obviously the tweet you're referring to is the one where I said replace the CZ with the Deagle, and I don't know if that'd be a good idea. That's kind of why I tweeted out something in my head that I'd kind of asked a few of the guys that we work with and a few of the other players and coaches, and they all find it to be an intriguing idea, but obviously there's no way to theorize what kind of impact it would have on the game. But I think it's a cool idea. I mean, because it kind of goes in line with what Valve has already showed. Remember when they made the changes to the USP and the Glock, they changed it so the USP would be better at long range. They changed it so the Glock would be more powerful at the close range, the way it's supposed to be. They changed the P250 to have incredible first bullet accuracy, I think it is. So they want that to be kind of like a long range, almost like a pistol sniper in a way. I guess the Deagle kind of takes that as well. But if you're gonna put these pistols into very narrow defined roles, then if you put it in the slot with the Deagle, then teams have to make the decision. Do you want to play, how many CZs do you want to have? Because if you have too few CZs, then later on in the game, when you have these kind of like half buys or force buys, you have to make the decision to get the more expensive Deagle and spend more money, which is going to impact kind of the next round if you're trying to force up some M4s. And then equally, if you have too many CZs, then maybe you kind of risk not having those Deagles at long range and being able to get picks. Then all of a sudden on your T side save rounds or eco or force buys, you have to go more of an execute style rather than being able to spread 3 Deagles or 4 Deagles across the map and hope one of them gets a headshot to thin out the defense. So I think that strategic choice is very interesting to me. And also one thing I notice is when you watch how teams play their anti-force buys, or they know they're going up against CZs or Deagles, especially on the T side, they have the thing that most often I see them fall into a trap is deciding how they want to attack. Do they want to attack as if they're going to be facing deagles or CZs, because it's a very different style. Obviously, if it's a deagle, if you do kind of a smoke execute and you do more utility, you can close the range and you can put the deagles into their awkward fights. But if you do that kind of a style and turn the corner, there's two CZs up close, you're just fucked because they know you're coming. They can be aggressive. They can be mobile. So I think it would help for teams to eventually judge, oh, this team is playing with three deagles. We can do a different style, for instance, than if they had five CZs. And I think that's a very cool wrinkle to throw into things.
It also raises the question of other spots where like one player buys, like who has a CZ equipped, buys, spends lots of his bank, which can potentially kind of create an awkward situation where someone needs to drop for him later, but just because in that specific round he has enough money to get all the CZs, and they really want more CZs that round as well.
Here's the one thing
like,
about
cool
the CZ that could ruin all that, and this is where that kind of a change that I tweeted out is with making no changes to the CZ. I think that there still needs to be some further things done, because if you're going to do that and you're going to slot it into a role, you obviously want the CZ to be like close to mid range. You want the deagle to be mid to long range. And the problem with the CZ now is it's even effective at long range. So it's one of those things. So you still probably need a change to the CZ itself to make it less impactful, at those longer distances where it's not great, but it can still do the work, right? We've seen it plenty of times. So that's kind of the tough part. I think that the hard part for Valve when they determine this is, correct me if I'm wrong, when they removed, or when they changed the Tech 9 and nerfed it into Oblivion, did they change the CZ in that update as well? Because we had never seen the CZ during that Tech 9 era. And all of a sudden, I think Valve in their head is saying, okay, if no one's using the CZ over the Tech 9, like, it's obviously not overpowered. But I think the logic that they're not seeing at that point is, no, the Tech 9 is just absolutely ridiculous, and it has been for months. But I don't remember if they changed the CZ as well.
I don't quite recall. I know that over time there's been a huge amount of changes to it, and it always stays pretty damn good. But I think that the Tech 9 as it was so overwhelmingly broken. There's actually a really funny update, which it's just so amusing to me, because we had the R8's revolver shenanigans, and for those who don't remember, they put the R8 into the game, and it was basically like better than the AWP. more or less. And the funny thing is that when they did that, they're like, all right, guys, we fixed all the pistols now, and here's this R8 gun. And it's like, you use all the other pistols, and actually all the other pistols were fantastic. The running accuracy on like the Tech 9 and the Glock, and like just all the pistols were like actually almost exactly where you would want to have them. They were kind of good, but really kind of generally useless from the running accuracy standpoint, but like from close range, like it reminded me much more of like pistols from like 1.6 or something, and I was like super happy. But then they're like, oh, sorry guys, the R8 is really broken.
Dude, we could have an entire show on some of the updates that Counter-Strike has had. Not even in a bad way, but I mean, remember the Deagle update when the Deagle became when it did like 60 damage per shot at long range, and its first bullet accuracy was perfect, so you could just crouch at the back of train and just snipe people with it, and you just tag them every single time and just get two shots to the body, and they're dead at the longest range. They had the AUG update where the AUG was godlike. Yeah, that was great.
Oh,
and I mean, remember back then as well. This is where I don't buy into that current culture we have, where Valve needs to fix the game. We've always had teams agree to the gentleman's agreement. We're not going to use an AUG during the game, or we're not going to use a deagle during the game. Now, obviously, that's not fair, because if you're playing for $50,000, are you going to stick to the gentleman's agreement of no AUGs? If you're down by 8 rounds, are you going to choose to do the AUG? Like, you could BM and do that's BM as fuck, and you'd get blasted into oblivion by the community and teams, but is it worth it? And I don't think that's a fair decision to put on the players, obviously. But we've always been self-regulating in some way, whether it's tournament organizers maintaining throughout an event that they're going to use the previous update, even if an update comes out in the middle of it, things of that nature.
Indeed. Well, moving forward from the gun discussion, and that being one of the current issues, do you, in sort of short form, do you think that things are as bad as people make it out to be? Because we do get people. I mean, obviously the CZ, it is kind of ridiculous in the hands of a professional player. Do you think it's as bad as people generally perceive it to be, or do you think people just complain a little bit too much? Is everything going to work out? In short.
I don't think it's as bad as people think it is, but I mean, it is, but in a way, it's not. And I know that's a ridiculous answer, but I'm looking at it, and when I say it's not as bad as people say it is, from one aspect, and that's when obviously from being from 1.6, being very old school player, I'm very much more of like a purist of Counter Strike, and I don't want to see save rounds and in these force buy rounds be as dangerous as they currently are in terms of how many are actually won. Um, I think. I think there's two things. One is I think we remember when people win these CZ rounds better than when they lose them, because we sit there and we say, yes, that affirms my beliefs that the CZ is overpowered, right? I don't think people win force buys nearly as much as we do think in our head. I think the tough part is the other dangerous part of that is how impactful they are. For example, when you force buy, and maybe you just have one player who can't afford everything. Maybe you have three M4s, an SMG, and a CZ. All of a sudden, that's a very dangerous buy. But I always wanted it to be that save rounds and force buys just didn't have a lot of danger to them. And I understand for the viewership and for the casual fan how that would be very boring. They'd be sitting there, they'd be saying, why the fuck is there a round in this game that just doesn't matter, right? Like the T's are off, like they can't win this round, so why are we even playing it? Why is this a thing? And I think I've come around to that understanding and that belief, and I've kind of been converted that there does need to be some element of danger to these rounds, and that's what we have now. The problem with the CZ is just it's just weird. It's really disconcerting seeing a pistol of that fashion that can be mobile, that can be accurate, that can do massive amount of damage at every single range, just doesn't seem to have a weakness, right? Like when you see people use it when they have an AK-47 to enter into a bomb site to turn a corner very, very quickly and try and get that one frag to a player in oranges. Like, yes, you're using the gun that has the better advantage, but it's like cognitive dissonance. It doesn't really, make sense in my brain that, a pistol is going to be better than a rifle in probably a majority of situations, which is I think the biggest issue that people have with it.
Yeah, it actually there's an entire podcast I want to do on combat mechanics in different esports games. And honestly, if you look at the CZ versus the Deagle, like the Deagle is more expensive, and it's so expensive, like you don't quite want to invest Kevlar as well. Like it's and so that means you have to be very, very good. Like you have to really understand the shots that will be coming your way, and you have to be very prepared and very quick. And then you have to get the headshot. You have to get on the first bullet. And I feel as though, like, not only is that very rewarding to watch, because it requires a very high skill ceiling to achieve consistently, or to achieve, like, because anyone can really get one, like quick deagle headshot against a professional. But if you get two or three, now we're talking about a situation that is just like very compelling to watch, requires a lot of skill. The other team they're going to hold their hands up and be like, you know what, that's something I couldn't have done anything about that. You just outplayed me there. And
conversely, the amount of times you've seen someone with a CZ running through a smoke, getting half blinded, and just holding the trigger, and like a bullet goes sideways and hits someone in the face, you're just like, oh, that's kind of stupid.
Yes. So from that perspective, I feel like the Deagle is like a very good comeback mechanic in this sense, and the CZ is Mario Kart like style comeback mechanic. So
I mean, it happens once in a while. I think, like, for instance, you have to. I know Anders and I casted a game. I believe it was at the last Star Ladder, where the two teams traded 8 or 9 rounds back and forth before a team won 2 in a row. And that's where you look at the like you said, the comeback mechanics, like, having a CZ or having SMGs that can play against rifles, or maybe not the SMGs themselves, but the bonus money coming from that 600 or whatever dollars for getting the kill. I think that's where you look at it and you say there's some issues that should be tweaked and fixed. Certainly in this game, like once you start having teams go back and forth for 8 or 9 rounds, it's gotten a bit ridiculous.
Indeed, it's definitely going to be very interesting to see how it sort of shapes up. I think overall we've been through a lot of peaks and troughs, and there's been a lot of issues, but I think generally speaking, we've always actually somehow Valve has actually sort of steered things in somewhat of an acceptable direction, generally speaking. So there's two things I want to ask you before I close the podcast out, and of course, I don't want to, run too much over your time, and we have to do the AMA thing quickly afterwards as well.
I'm here. I'm here for you, sweetheart.
So off of that point, this has been a huge issue within the present scene. Well, in fact, all of Counter-Strike, maybe in every single iteration, perhaps. Are Valve involved enough, or is their approach because their approach is very different to other games. Like there is, I think people they create a lot of a very big comparison between Dota and maybe other games that Valve are running. And other companies and so on, but Valve with Counter-Strike have a fairly specific style, and they're quite hands-off. We have, as a result of this, a free market, which is actually the best case for growth in a new industry. And CSGO has benefited from this enormously. The fact that we have independent tournament organizers, the fact that they have to bid for majors, the fact that Valve will put in money to support these organizations, which are grassroots esports organizations, I think in almost every case. And then also the same from like, people who are working on broadcasting and this, that, and the other. Like, it is a free market, and I think that's very good for CSGO and its development. But obviously there are some drawbacks to that approach, and generally speaking, people they don't think Valve is hands-on enough. Do you think that's a legitimate criticism, or do you think it's just the nature of the style that Valve have?
That's a tough kind of question to answer. You can look at it from a couple different angles. If you look at it, the current culture within gaming, and I should preface this and say I do not consider myself to be a gamer. I don't play a lot of video games. I don't buy the new games as they come out. I don't even own a console. I own a Switch and a PC. And like I said, I played 3 video games essentially. So I don't call myself a gamer, so I don't know everything about all the other games. But if you look at the culture that a lot of the gamers today have, is that they want a more hands-on. And you look at the way that these new games are being developed, it's not about the game at release. It's about, the ability to build upon that. It's about the DLCs that are going to come out. It's about, releasing a game and then having it open enough to where you can add on to it for 2 years down the road with in-game purchases, with these microtransactions, all that kind of stuff. And in that sense, a lot of gamers have gotten used to having a lot of developer input, and a lot of developers have kind of gone that style of where they're going to be listening to the community. They're going to be tweaking as they go. And in that sense, obviously Counter-Strike is just far too hands-off to today's modern gamers, I think. But on the other hand of that, being the old school gamer, and from that perspective, I say, stop being a pussy. Like, we don't need the constant updates. We really don't need them, especially when you look at Counter-Strike, where they don't update for the esports kind of side of things. They don't update for the competitive side. They do updates for the casual base more so. They look at a lot of data from the casual players, and obviously that's no secret at this point. So that's where you kind of can see some of the understanding. And as an esports person, I hate that, but I understand it from their point of view. The tough part where this kind of conversation gets sticky, and this is another one where we don't want to go too deep because we could go on about this for hours, is at what point is there an actual obligation for Valve to be loyal to the esports division? With the amount of attention that Counter-Strike as an esports has, you could essentially call this like free marketing for Valve, right? For the amount of time and money that they put into it, they're getting so much free marketing. Now, you don't want them to interact too much because they don't actually make like straight cash off of it the way that an organizer might if they sell enough sponsorships, or if they sell enough tickets, or the way a team might be able to sell sponsorships on their players. But there is a lot of eyeballs on Counter-Strike. Every time there's a major, there's millions of dollars, or there's millions of viewers. And with with how public and Counter-Strike as a game has been because of the esports side of things, do they owe us anything? And that's always going to be the tough question, because I think you're going to get esports people who say, yeah, obviously they owe it to us to help us out and kind of give us some of the updates that we asked for, and changes to these weapons that are obviously broken when you put them in professional hands. But for them, they're saying, listen, we built and developed this game, and without our assistance, you guys have now gotten salaries of $20,000 a month for your professional players, so we don't really owe you anything. So it's always going to be a give and take. And obviously I personally would like to see a little bit more. Doesn't have to be like public interaction, doesn't have to be explanations or anything like that. It would be cool to have like a map of their thought process every time there was an update, or with some of the bigger updates. A little bit of love shown towards things like the CZ, which are provably a little bit unfair in scenarios and a little bit overpowered and things like that. But overall, I said this in a podcast the other day as well. I don't understand the people who are so starved for a new operation. Like, I don't understand the need for a new operation every 5 or 6 months or anything like that, or new content being added. Because when I look at Counter-Strike, it's the same game, but it's a new experience every single time you play a game, because decisions are always going to be different. Not only your decision, but your opponent's decision, which puts you in an entirely new scenario. And for me, that's why I've been able to play and watch this game for 18, 19 years, is because every experience is different within the game, whether it's a match or not. So, the only thing that's kind of bogging it down is the kind of the schedule and the sheer amount of Counter-Strike there is. But we've even been able to survive that. And even just to circle back to the beginning of the podcast, the schedule that we have now and the amount of Counter-Strike being played, like if you look at all the tournaments and all the online leagues, we have probably, over 1,000 days worth of Counter-Strike content pushed into a 365-day calendar. I mean, that is a catastrophe in and of itself. I do not know how people are able to consume that much CS. But I mean, focusing on your original question, I think it'd be nice, but it's not needed. And I think everyone needs to kind of get over that fact. This is the Valve we have. We're surviving, and even we're flourishing without it. We're at the point where we have, like I just said, we have too much Counter-Strike. Like, why are people complaining about the game? Obviously, they're doing something right, and that people are still playing it, people are still watching it.
It's so based on that, like, I mean, I think again, you talk about like the three marked sort of approach that they have, and also I think previously you were talking about you kind of sectioned issues into stuff that we can control and stuff that Valve controls. And obviously this is a very different perspective to, let's say, a Riot or a Blizzard who have, who in both cases, they have complete exclusive control over their products, and you can't take a step out, out of line without it having a repercussion if it's not demanded by them. So from that perspective, considering that we do have a lot of power in where we're standing, and looking at all the companies that have come into CS:GO, Turner Sports, any other TV company that's been television company that's been interested. What do you think the future looks like for CS:GO? Considering that, as you say, like so much of it is within our hands. Like, what would tournament organizers like? What should they do? How should things look for a better ecosystem overall for the viewers, for the players, and for everyone else that's involved in the Counter-Strike infrastructure?
Well, I mean, it's just touching on the LCS, the OWL thing. I think it's funny that, just we always have the conversation about Valve and do they do enough, where, everyone still, I think, pretty much agrees that we'd want to stay away from that kind of a model where it's directly controlled by the developer. The future of Counter-Strike is very interesting. It's obviously, I've given it a lot of thought just because it has such a huge impact on my path and my career as a eSports commentator, only doing Counter-Strike. It's the only game I've ever done. I see this always happens at the end of towards the middle portion of the year. Pretty much every year consistently since I started commentating back in 2015 is when I really started getting busy with it. There's always been that feeling, next year is the year where things are going to get figured out. We've always been in this state of chaos of not knowing who's going to win. Is it going to be ECS or ESL? Is it going to be, a Blast has come in? Is it going to be E-League to take things over? And you've always been like, oh, this is this kind of cool buildup, and next year something's going to get solved, and nothing ever does. And I think part of the reason why that is because the players hold so much power and so much value of where the viewers go, and the players as a group are obviously disorganized. The players union conversation has been going on for like 3 years now, it feels. And I mean, it's not a criticism at them, because I've tried to unite the commentators. That attempt has been done by a couple different people even before me, to have some kind of an organized structure. And that's not easy, just to get 10 people to think the same way. But I see some kind of a future where I think next year will be the year. No, but there is going to have to be some kind of decision. I think teams are going to have to start making the call. Do you want to play in online leagues? Are they valuable enough for you as a team, and as an organization, and as branding, for you to spend your time playing in online leagues that, everyone pretty much agrees don't have an impact on your standings, or don't really influence the way we think about your team? It's just kind of exposure. And especially with the advent of Facebook coming out, is it enough exposure for some of these?
Just to interrupt you there, are we going to do away with online leagues now? Because as you say, Facebook and YouTube, the viewership has not been as good as in the Twitch iteration of broadcasting online leagues, when we had betting as well, which was rife. The numbers are completely different. Is this?
And betting's coming back, baby. Legal betting, of course. Yeah, I don't know. Only gamble if you're 18. Yeah, I don't know. those are decisions that I think teams are going to have to start making by themselves, and who knows the way they're going to go. The place I was going to take that kind of conversation was, I think we're going to start seeing teams sign up, whether it's to ESL, or whether it's to Blast, or whether it's to ECS. I think we're going to have to start seeing teams make a decision whether they play in the online leagues or not. I think they're going to have to make the decision if they want to play in one league or not. And the funny thing is, that's just going to be further troubles, because again, that goes along the lines of splitting the community, like I talked about with 1.6 and Source. If all of a sudden you're splitting viewers between, some viewers are going to want to follow ECS, some viewers are going to want to follow ESL, some viewers are going to want to follow whatever other league there is, and then all of a sudden you have two leagues getting decent viewership but not able to really make any money off of it, whereas you could have one league that's making great viewership and everyone could kind of thrive. And I think that's kind of the concept that organizations like the OWL and LCS have, is to concentrate all that viewership on one league and one kind of tournament circuit, to make it consolidated for viewers. And there's a lot of benefits in that kind of a model, and there's a lot of benefits in our kind of a model. But I think we are going to see teams start to make that decision. And then I think, down the road even further, if Counter-Strike survives that long, we're going to see eventually a decision will have to be made, to come back and reunite in one league. And the reason I think that is being from America, I've seen it. I didn't personally see it happen, but it happened in the history of our sports leagues. There used to be the NFL and the AFL. There used to be it was the NBA and the ABA, and there were two different leagues with two different regions, essentially, kind of like a West Coast, East Coast type thing. Two sets of teams in each one, and you were always kind of stuck wondering which team is better, right? And they've all essentially joined forces. The NBA and the ABA came together to make the NBA, which is thriving. The NFL and the AFL came together, which is now thriving. So, I mean, oddly enough, I've looked into reading books about how those mergers occurred. What were the political forces around it? What were the business forces around it, to kind of get some kind of idea, to try and map out, maybe even just loosely, what the kind of conditions will look like for that in the esports ecosystem. So I don't know if anyone listening has recommendations for that. I haven't been able to find a good one that seems reliable. But those are the kind of always the interesting things to me on this conversation, is there's got to be a decision made somewhere by the players, and I don't think they're united enough to all make the decision to go to one, and nor necessarily do I think that'd be a great thing at this juncture in time. So I do think we're going to see a split coming up in the next year, where certain players go towards one and certain teams go towards the other.
I think it's a very good point that you're making too, because I think what you're speaking to also is that there's a huge timeline for development like this, and what would happen first, as you say, is a split. But that's as your example with the ABA and NBA, AFL and NFL goes, it's not necessarily the end picture. And I think that's also a strength of the model, as you're describing, is the fact that again it's like it's very free market. It's very much the whole, like, whoever provides the best service, and in the continued fight to provide that best service to get all the business is where people will eventually flock towards. Sort of assuming, hopefully, that the whole player situation gets a little bit more organized within the future, but hopefully that will happen.
And here's kind of the other side of the coin, right? We know that tournament organizers, they've said it themselves publicly, and I think plenty of people have said it publicly involved in the scene. There's really not tournament organizers at the moment in Counter-Strike that are making money, which is scary. So I think what's going to happen is that split's going to come in, and whoever can figure out a way to make money and have reliable revenue streams around their tournament circuit is going to be the winner eventually. The problem at the moment is, since esports is such a buzzword when it comes to investment, when it comes to business, when it, just in general in the public, so many people want to get involved right now, they're willing to burn cash. They're willing to invest in losing endeavors to see if it will turn around. And none of them are obviously turning around, and for whatever reason, whether it's personnel, whether it's the format of their tournament structure, whether it's, how much money they're spending on and creating this structure. This is part of the reason why we're not seeing any kind of loser. You like think back to like early CS:GO, when you had in North America, before Faceit kind of expanded here, it was ESEA versus CEVO. And when CEVO came back and kind of started running their league, everyone was like, great competition for ESEA, except ESEA had so much money that they didn't give a shit, and CEVO had no money. In fact, they didn't have the money to fight even close, whether it was in prize pool or whether it was within infrastructure of their own site and organization, whether it was in development of their own clients. So the fact that ESEA was able to provide much better product and actually make money, CEVO could only compete for a year and a half, and Now they're out of business pretty much, and are not able to be in it. And we don't see that happening in the current ecosystem because people are willing to just to spend money that they don't necessarily have or that they're not going to get a return on in the short term because they're betting on the long term. And that's kind of that's where the bubble comes in, right? That's where we're all just like, shit, when is this going to happen? When is this going to pop? And certainly I expect to see some pops of this bubble, maybe not entirely collapsing, but there is going to be some failures coming up in our near future.
It is actually very interesting from like an investment standpoint, looking at the various businesses that you would want to invest in the space. As you were mentioning, ECA and Faceit are really good examples of like two businesses that have sort of a sustainable model behind their their own investment into esports. Because that's kind of like in a sense, like Face and ECA, they're just subscription models, and they're generating revenue for providing a competitive service, and platform to play competitively. But at the same time, like both companies would then decide to put that revenue into their esports like media department and tournament department, which is kind of a separate thing. And there's not really anyone else that has sort of platforms out there that sort of has that subscription model providing any sustainability. A lot of companies are doing, like ESL, for example, has often been using this sort of white label model to try to generate revenue on like trying to get contracts from various different developers to run leagues and so on, and that it seemingly has not been a very sustainable way to make money. That's a very good point that you bring up there. Very, very good question, and perhaps it's where we should end this podcast. But I think we should
Ending on a
I,
question. The sequel is going to come.
I mean, actually, within this podcast in of itself, there's so many really cool discussion points that we could dive into. But actually, you know what? Let's finish things on a positive note, or maybe a negative note. Depends on you. Do you think the future looks good? Like, regardless of all of the questions and uncertainties, do you have a general good feeling for your future in Counter-Strike? Because obviously the two are linked together.
Yeah, no, I do have a very positive one, and I think this is a good place to end it because it does circle back to some of those conversations we had at the start about some of the catastrophes. And I've seen Counter-Strike survive. I have a lot of faith in this game, and I think it's very telling that you still see a lot of people publicly who maybe aren't necessarily as involved in Counter-Strike, but Counter-Strike is still talked about with universal respect in terms of its ability to be watched and its ability to be produced as an esports venture and a game. It is one of the most watchable esports we have out there, if not the most. And I think it's very weird to me that the majority of the conversation about Counter-Strike dying or Counter-Strike phasing out is coming from within our own community. And I wish I really liked Andrew's tweet where he's like, everyone kind of grow up and kind of, we don't have to all be sounding the alarm bells and abandoning ship right now. Everything's still going good. I do think the future is good, and I just it's going to take some time to get there. I think across everything in esports, despite the progress that we've made, there's still so many question marks. There's still so many questions we have to answer. But I think I came into 2018 with kind of my New Year's resolution for myself was for work. Well, there was two of them. The one was to find time to get involved in some of the hobbies that I used to have that I've let fall by the wayside, which I'm doing. And the other was find ways as a commentator, because you've hung out with us, Dan. You don't do the full circuit the way that we do, but that when you get with us, we do have a lot of things that we kind of complain about. And it's not necessarily because we hate our jobs or we hate what we do. It's because there are a lot of things that need to be fixed. And my second resolution was to be someone who didn't, like, I'm obviously still going to complain because it's fun. But the second resolution was to be someone who's working to improve and fix some of those mistakes. Because I'm just tired of only complaining about them and not actually getting enough done to reverse those fortunes. So I'm working on that as well. And I think that goes for every aspect, whether it's as a player, as a tournament organizer, as a league administrator, as a commentator, obviously. I think everyone kind of needs to take an increased responsibility and not look at Valve and say, our game is dying because Valve doesn't update it. No, our game, if there's struggles in our game, which, there are not necessarily negative struggles, there's always going to be some kind of a struggle, and that's a good thing. You always want to be fighting for something better. But, the ones that we solve are, the schedule is the big one, as I'm always going to harp on that. I think from a player perspective, I think we need to, I think we need to solve the ability to have, a profitable semi-amateur, semi-pro league and division. The MDL is a good start. FPL is a great addition. Rank S is a great addition. Ways for the semi-pro players to be discovered. I think, the buyout clauses and contracts are one as well. So all of this needs to be figured out, but there are plenty of struggles that we have in this industry that all of us working in it need to take more responsibility to solve. And then once that starts happening, I'm going to feel much, much better. But I still have a lot of faith that those things can get done, and that the future of Counter-Strike is always going to remain bright.
Wow, what a sobering note to finish on.
Boom!
Responsibility. We must all take Nova seriously. That sounds great. I mean, I definitely agree with you. If you're ever in a position to complain, you also, the second part of that always has to be the fact that you're willing to take action to try to address that complaint. And we don't necessarily see enough of that. So if there's anything I can do to help you, you got to let me know. And I'm definitely, I think we as you say, like, we all need to try to be positive actors. I think we're living in an outrage culture. We're living in a culture that promotes just waving your stick at things from a distance, but not really getting your hands dirty and trying to fix it. So all about that. So thank you very much, Jason. This was a really enjoyable talk, and I hope to have many more in the future with you.
Yeah, you too, man. Thanks for having me, and obviously always a pleasure, and I'll see you soon.
Well, that conversation was awesome. I really enjoyed that one, and definitely going to have to get Jason back onto the show. Hopefully, if I ask, he agrees. Either way, I honestly was quite impressed with considering the breadth of topics covered, the depth and balance of depth that we achieved on those, because in the future with Jason, I'll probably aim to have sort of more laser-focused conversations around, less issues, less topics, and more of a dive into those things and more of an exploration of those things. So this was kind of a cool format to sort of experiment with, and I think having a personal friendship with Jason probably helps the rapport there as well. Either way, you may be wondering, where is the AMA? You were tweeting about questions for Jason for an AMA. Where is it? So to explain how that's going to work in the future, I will have AMA compilation episodes. So, for example, I'll have 4 guests. You've got Jason, Sean, Launders, and whoever the fourth one will end up being. And I actually need to go and record with Launders and Sean because I didn't have this idea when I did record with them previously. And I guess it works out now because my audio quality is a bit better here at home. But at the end of these 4 podcasts, I'll have an episode which will be a compilation of the AMAs for each individual. I think that's kind of a nice way to create more diversity to the content and use time efficiently with the guests, especially as I like to take no more than like 90 minutes of their time for a recording session for the podcast and any additional things I'm doing. And that's something that I hope will enable me to get more guests, because I think for a lot of people, they definitely have time sensitivity issues and perhaps don't want to block out an entire 3-4 hours to make sure that they have time for a podcast or something similar to that. And I think there's definitely some people such as Thorin and Richard Lewis who are doing great work with the longer form content of this nature, anything beyond the 90 minutes, which my realm I would say is between 60 and 90 minutes ultimately. Either way, that's how it's going to work. And so you can look out, follow me on Twitter @followddk, and you'll see when I'm tweeting about an upcoming guest, and you can respond with your questions, and hopefully they will be answered. I do try to direct the guests through the questions fairly rapidly, and without sacrificing any of the entertainment value. Either way, moving on to the final topic. If you guys have any questions for me, then you can use the hashtag AskDDK, and I'll check the hashtag, and once there are enough questions, I will be sort of front loading that little talk, or well, I suppose it's kind of an AMA as well. I'll be front loading that into the next podcast, where when I have enough questions that maybe I can generate like a 10-minute segment at the very least. I'll probably try to keep it fairly short at the beginning of the podcast. And as always, if you have any feedback, you can hit me up on Twitter at followddk once again, or any other forum that you may, the podcast may be being discussed upon, such as Reddit or something similar to that. Otherwise, that is all from me. In addendum to episode 3, Past, Present, and Future with Jason Moses O'Toole. I kind of like that title. Either way, I'll see you guys for the next episode. Hope you enjoyed it.